today it's the turn of the GTI that you probably see least often on the UK roads. Hello guys, and welcome to this VolksWizard video, which is the fourth in a series of 8 celebrating 45 years of the Golf GTI. In episodes 1 to 3 we looked at the Mark 7 Club Sport S, the Mark 6 Edition 35 and most recently the original Mark 1. Well, today it's the turn of the GTI that you probably see least often on the UK roads. It is of course the Mark 3. But before we have a closer look at it, let's remind ourselves what the world was like when the Mark III took over from the much loved Mark II back in 1992. If the Mark II Golf GTI signified the heady days of the 1980s boom, when greed was good and your red braces matched the pinstripe on the front of your GTI, the Mark III typified the more subdued sentiment of the post-recession 1990s. Gone were those iconic BBS wheels, replaced by a set many compares to plastic wheel trims. Even the iconic red stripe was no more. Under the bonnet, the 4-cylinder normally aspirated 8-valve engine of the Mark II GTI had grown from 1.8 to 2 litres, but rather than enhancing the driving experience, the new tall block engine had lost the sweetness of the old one, its free revving top end replaced by more accessible torque. Horsepower did go up from 112 to 115, but the power to weight ratio went down to a tragic 112 horsepower per tonne, equating to a 0 to 62 time of a slothful 9.6 seconds. Environmental legislation bear down heavily on manufacturers in the 90s, and the Mark III was a lot better in this respect than its predecessor, with a standard catalytic converter, water-based paint and plastic components labelled to aid recycling. 2 years later, we got a 16-valve version of the Mark III Golf GTI with 150 horsepower and a much more respectable 0 to 62 time of 8.3 seconds, which just happens to match the original Mark I Golf GTI to perfection. I guess you could call that progress. The beasting aerial made its welcome return, and when coupled with bold red 16-valve badges and unique 5-spoke Monte Carlo alloy wheels, the 16-valve was marked out as something a little bit special. But its problem was, for not an awful lot more money, the VR6, which was launched in 1992, was seen by more people as even more special. None of them had a particularly great chassis, but the narrow angle V6's extra weight made the VR6 even worse. Not much changed throughout the production run of the Mark III Golf GTI, but there were a few subtle tweaks for the 1995 and 1996 model years, including ABS, driver's airbag and engine immobiliser all becoming standard. There was a general perception that these cars had been to the Wolfsburg gym, with quality and handling noticeably improving, and demand remained strong until the Mark IV's arrival in late 1997. In fact, so great was the demand that production of some models, including the GTI, was switched to Uitenhage in South Africa, while Wolfsburg was being tooled up to build the new car. In 1996, we got the Anniversary edition, which was built to celebrate 20 years of the Golf GTI. This saw the return of the BBS alloy wheels and the iconic red pinstripe, as well as numerous other detail changes which made it much more of a GTI to look at. But because it was mechanically identical to the normal 8-valve and 16-valve models, it was no more of a GTI to drive. Just 750 of these came to the UK, making it a proper limited edition. These were divided between 500 8-valve models and 250 16 valves. According to the website How Many Left, just 50 of these remain registered in the UK today. In total, the UK bought just under 40,000 Mark III Golf GTIs, but due to the high rate of attrition caused by corrosion, very few remain on the road today. Once again, according to How Many Left, there are just 205 16 valves and under 1,000 8 valves in the UK right now. Okay, enough talking. Let's have a look around this fantastic example of the Mark III Golf GTI, fresh from Volkswagen UK's heritage fleet. Now, I'm really looking forward to giving you guys a tour of this car because the Mark III Golf GTI does mean a lot to me personally. It's my second ever GTI after a Mark II. I bought a 1993 model back in 1999. I kept that for a year and then I upgraded to the Anniversary 8-valve which was a great car. That was my last personal car before I started volkswizard. I actually sold that to go and get some cash together and buy and sell cars, and that was back in 2002, and here we are today. Okay, so let's take in this car. Now I should point out two things. Firstly, it is a 16 valve model. You cannot tell because the 16 valve badge that should be here is missing. If it was an 8 valve, it would have GTI in silver, but if it was a 16 valve, it would have a red 16 valve badge that was quite distinctive. Other than that, it looks just like an 8 valve. The other thing to point out is that this is an S-Reg car. Most Mark IIIs were registered by R-Reg. There are a few South African built cars that carried on beyond that, and there are some estates that went all the way to V, but it's very unusual to have a Wolfsburg built car like this one is on an S-Reg. I presume it was sitting around for quite a long time before it was registered. It's been sitting around for quite a long time since, because it's only on 994 miles right now. We should take it over the 1,000 when we do the test drive shortly. Okay, there is nothing really exciting to talk about here, but there are subtle differences over the other models. So GTIs and VR6s got this twin reflector headlight. It's not xenon, it just means you have a bulb for main beam and you have a bulb for dip beam. Normal Mark IIIs had just one bulb that did the lot, and the headlight looked like that right the way across. You got a colour-coded grille, you got partially body-coloured bumpers. The later VR6 had fully colour-coded bumpers, but the GTI remained like this, which it had from day one. Some of the basic Mark IIIs had, believe it or not, black plastic bumpers all the way from top to bottom. The later GTIs got the fog lights as standard here, which are often broken. The spoiler was initially deeper up until about 1995. The spoiler was probably about to here, but a lot of people ripped them off. So GTI and VR6 had this smaller spoiler to make them a bit easier to live with. You do get the plastic wheel arch trims, just like a Mark II, and sill covers as well. With the GTI logo here, very subtle, not red, just discreet silver. The wheels came in about 1995, and they're an improvement over the originals that did look like plastic wheel trims. They're also a little bit wider, 6.5 inches, and that means the tyre goes up from 195/50 of the early cars to 205/50/15, giving it a little bit more traction. At the back we have tinted rear lights, which were only used on the VR6 GTI and the driver model, which was a look-alike GTI, a bit like an R-Line is to an R. There is a visible exhaust, if you can just about see it down there, two little pea shooters that were unique to GTI and I think VR6. So it was different to the other models, the GLs and the CLs, but it didn't exactly scream performance. Before I forget, the side repeaters were originally orange and rectangular. For the 96 model year, they became clear and rectangular. Okay, let's have a look inside. There you go, 994 miles on the clock, and it smells, God, just like they did back in the late 90s. So this interior is called cockpit cloth. It's a little bit buckety. It's a bit different to the early GTI interior, which was woven and you could snag that. So this is very easy to live with. You could have had leather, which came with seat heating, or the real trick option was to have Recaro bucket seats that were a much more heavily bolstered version of this. They had Recaro in them, and I think the headrests were set into the seat a bit. They were the real cool seat to have, but they had exactly the same fabric as this. It's not particularly exciting down here. We had standard electric windows. The standard sunroof, which the early cars got, had been deleted by this point. We got the driver's airbag. You could spec a passenger one that was around there somewhere, around the glove box, but this car doesn't have that. In fact, it's a very basic car because it doesn't even have air conditioning. If it did, there'd be an extra button, I think, here to turn it on and off. What I do like though is that the cigarette lighter, unlike on most modern cars, is live when the ignition's not on, so I can charge up my GoPro battery really easily. These cars for the UK market all have Sony stereos. This one looks a bit later than the ones that I've seen in Mark IIIs, and they all make this distinctive tone to remind you to take the face off. Wow, that really takes me back a long way. So let me just try and take the face off this. Gosh, it's been a long time. There we go. So you meant to put that in a little case and take it with you. Of course, many people didn't, and people still stole those quite readily back in the 90s. And even in Birmingham, if you took the face off, somebody would still nick the back of it because they knew they could get a face from somewhere else. Let me just try and put that back on. There we go. Gosh, that was a fiddle, wasn't it? Now they just steal the whole car. Though we've got a plastic rim steering wheel here, nothing special. We do have ABS, which was a big safety feature. We also have an immobiliser. This isn't like a Logic 500, which was a dealer fit thing, which requires on this car to be pushed into a slot down here. I don't know if that's because the batteries are flat in the remote. You push that in there, and then we should have contact. There we go, so you get the ignition lights, we're good to go. You can start it without pressing the clutch. And the ABS light, which came on, should go off. Wow. Ultrasonic sensors for the alarm, check that out. Light coloured headlining, which is not very sporty, but it does make the car a little bit lighter in here. Oh, look at that gear knob. I mean, okay, it's mint and it's got all the grain on it, but how little time went in designing that. This sort of rubbery, totally not even trying to look like leather boot as well. Very basic handbrake. And yet, at the time, people lapped these up. I've sold many of these in the sort of, well, from about 2002 to about 2008, and they were good cars, never really went wrong. Brilliant. Right, let's have a look under the bonnet, where I can prove to you it really is a 16 valve because there is nothing in here. Oh yeah, well, we haven't got a telescopic bonnet strut just yet. We need the Mark IV for that, so bear with me. Okay, so it's definitely a 16 valve. It says it right there, but you can tell because it's got that distinctive inlet manifold. It looks very much like the one on the Mark II, but it's a lot cleaner down here because we've got proper fuel injection on the Mark II with Cagetronic. There are loads of pipes everywhere which aren't on this car. It's also got a cable change gearbox, which was quite new for the Mark III. ABS there, which was very rare on the Mark II. We've got the alarm there, an immobiliser. Right, that's taken me back many, many years. Let's see how the driving experience feels like today in 2021. Okay, here we are driving the Mark 3 GTI, and the first thing you notice is that it feels pretty normal. It doesn't feel like a throwback car like a Mark II or Mark 1. It feels relatively modern, to the point where you could give the keys to a normal person, tell them to drive it, and they wouldn't have too much of an issue. And that's because we've got power steering, which every Mark 3 GTI had. That wasn't the case with the Mark II. Quite important because even this car doesn't have air conditioning. It's a very late model, top of the range GTI being a 16 valve, it was still an option. We don't have a sunroof, so you could work up a sweat quite easily if you didn't have power steering. We've got ABS brakes, which were one of the biggest innovations of safety for the modern car. And whilst you have to change gear manually, which might be a bit weird to some people, it's perfectly agreeable to do so. This cable change box by 98 had been refined to the point where you could just snick it up and down the gears for fun, and you probably wouldn't need to in this car because we've got 16 valves under the bonnet and they need some revs to get going, but they do, they will sing, and it makes quite a nice noise as well. But the chassis kind of just put you off a bit because its body control is pretty much non-existent compared to a modern Golf. It does feel dangerous, and bear in mind this is a low mileage example, so you can get carried away rather a bit. Tuners did sell a lot of suspension kits for these cars, and for good reason. Brakes, as well as ABS, are also quite big. They're 288mm, and that means they actually stop like a modern car as well. So yeah, it's not bad. It's such a needy, good GTI, especially with this engine. I mean, this car has just clocked 1,000 miles So it's still pretty tight, I reckon, with, well, I should remember, with a few thousand miles on them, they do rev a bit more cleanly, but that's not bad. Yeah, there she swings. So there we have, guys, the Mk3 Golf GTI. It won't be at the top of the list in the Hall of Fame of GTIs, but it's not a bad one, particularly when fitted with a 16-valve engine. And if somebody offered me one, particularly an anniversary model, today, I would absolutely be overjoyed to have one in a collection. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching this VolksWizard video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. Please do comment, please do share, please do subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one very soon.